structure. The Arab Spring was heavily influenced and shaped by the capacity for social media to bring people together. If we look at the recent climate protests, started by an 11-year-old, I think she was in Sweden, and it became an international movement, primarily because of effective strategizing with social movement. That can be really good. And so I think, yes, you're always going to have the possibility of surveillance. Different societies have that as more of, if you're trying to do that in China, that's going to be different than, to some extent, maybe trying to do it here in the United States, even though we can do it if we wanted to, or we have the power. So I want to put a plug in for social media as a positive. But having said that, I also think it requires us to be incredibly vigilant and knowledgeable about where the information for our protests are coming from. Because if we look at the Russia investigation and the Russia influence in the 2016 elections, they were back basically using social media to foment protests on both sides of an issue. They would, go on and, get right side people, sort of pro-Trump people and pro-Hillary people, and they catalog, real world protests where they basically kind of, as a sort of creating chaos. So if we think this is a strategy to use, we need to be really thoughtful, and that's where the sort of combination of face-to-face or try and be confident that, like, if you get something from a friend, right back to the friend on there and say, look, I got this message, is this really legit? Because then I think you can possibly use social media in some effective ways, flash mobs and stuff like that. So anyway, I don't know if anybody wants to comment on positive uses of social media that they've seen or they participated in.
Yeah, so I've seen a lot of positives come from social media. One thing that I've really noticed is, and you can take this as a negative or a positive, but what I believe is websites deciding what they want on their social media and how they want to show it. Some websites, to name a few, YouTube and Twitter are cracking down on the use of conspiracies. If you put a conspiracy video, they're starting to pop that, like, here's information, go to it. Now, it may be Wikipedia information, but they're still trying to combat this whole misinformation. And so, like, websites like Twitter and YouTube are starting to crack down on this, whole ordeal of that kind of stuff. But I think there is positives when it can come to protesting. I don't doubt that at all. I think there can also be negatives as well. I mean, I've been on the internet for so long, probably most of my natural born life as it is, I can tell you a lot of negatives, but there are always positives when it comes to social media.
One positive I can immediately think of is the ability that social media has to get rhetoric out there and get people talking about it. Cancel culture immediately comes to mind. For example, canceling R. Kelly, muting his music. I think a big part of how that went on, I don't know if everyone knows about the R. Kelly situation, but basically he's been accused of a lot of sexual harassment, sexual indecency, sexual assault with minors, and then also just preying on young women in general. But I think the social media movement and the Mute R. Kelly hashtag did a lot in actually getting the issue out there, getting it into the courts again, because I remember reading and just being really happy that Spotify had taken his music off of there, slowing down his payroll, making sure that getting allies out there, things like that. I think social media does really well.
To bounce off of that, I think social media does a really good job of bringing people together who may not be able to meet face to face. For just example, if you look just in America in general, you could be on two completely different parts of the country, but if you have a same belief and you are part of a group that is advocating for that, maybe in your chapter you could go bring ideas there and then share that and they can bring it elsewhere. So I think it's positive for that. But then to go back to what you were saying about how, I don't remember what I was talking about specifically, but I think just one drawback of social media is how oftentimes, I mean, there's a lot of people who just scroll through and like don't interact with it, but I think social media can be, I don't know if it's so much negative, but it's not very helpful for the apathetic middle who may not care about an issue or who may see something very polarized and be just immediately turned off from the issue, or people feel like they can't ask questions about it because they might get attacked by somebody or something along those lines. With the last point I said, I think that's getting better, where people are finding, if they're interested in learning more about a topic, they're finding people who are willing to talk to them about it, but I still think social media has its faults regardless.
Sure. One last thing, I think misinformation can also lead to protests on social media. I think this college witnessed one of the worst misinformation protests of this college's ever era this past semester. No matter what you think of the whole ordeal, people were flinging like all this misinformation, and they would no doubt in my mind consider what they were doing protesting. So I think that's something we can see as a negative coming from protesting online, is misinformation really adding fuel to a fire. Again, don't care about the whole aspect of it, but that's an example.
Of course, I'll just maybe add my own little comment here. It cuts both ways, right? You said sort of groups can form who otherwise wouldn't be able to sort of, know that they even kind of exist out there, and so you're able to mobilize and kind of get groups organized. At the same time, of course, we also have seen a rise in hate crimes and hate groups, right? At the same time, white supremacists, homophobes who kind of find their chat rooms and place to organize, and so, there's a lot of that dark side as well, unfortunately. So, I know you wanted to say one more thing. So.
Just one more question.
Sure.
Just to bounce off what Parker was saying, I think another, not negative of social media, but just negative of quick news and wanting to know what happened when it happened, is that we get misinformation and we get unfinished stories or unconfirmed stories that people then believe or they spread around and then sometimes end up spreading like wildfire. So I'd say that not necessarily social media's fault, but just technology era and how people, just want the news when it happens.
Next up, we have Dr. Bob.
I want to take off in terms of social media, chaos, a great question, and this idea of social media being leaderless. I think there's a dark side to that. And I'm not saying that Darth Vader is leading it, but there are government agencies or outside agencies outside of the US or some other country that have co-opted some of these movements specifically to generate chaos, where they take both sides in the middle of anything just to sow this discord. And I think they're doing it for their own particular agenda, whatever that might be. And I'm thinking right now of the agencies that are running out of Russia and North Korea and perhaps other places too. So I think we have to keep that in mind, that is in the back, running underneath the radar for a large part, because I'm sure we're not seeing even the tip of the proverbial iceberg of what comes out in the national media.
You want to turn your comment into a question?
Nope.
Possibly? Anybody
I'm a biologist, I don't.
Anybody wants to comment on the comment?
I guess I just want that. And I know it's easier with social media now to do that and have the dark part, but that wasn't just because of the technology we have now. Like if you look at, I mentioned before the Black Panthers, how like FBI had infiltrated and they paid people to be there and infiltrate and get information. So I don't think social media is the only way for outside sources to infiltrate, but it definitely makes it easier.
When I was in 6th grade, we had a movie about political subterfuge, in which we learned about whispering campaigns. And this is that you got 5-10 people in an elevator, and you would whisper loud enough so that everyone would hear, and you would start subverting one candidate or another. This social media is just an expansion of that.
Other questions? I want to maybe ask 2 more questions. Since we have a student question, I hope, Gary, it's okay if we go with that one.
So just jumping back to physical protests, I was wondering if Brian can give a little more insight into kind of the planning and strategies used in protests, both on a local school scale and citywide scale.
I will say that I did use social media a lot to help planning. The biggest thing I would say with the school scale is group chats. They work wonders getting people to actually be able to talk to each other without actually having to meet up at a local coffee shop or something like that. Other plan that went into it. We would decide to show up to school maybe an hour early, use the printer, print out a bunch of flyers and stuff like that. Kind of something that we would be able to do here as well. What other kind of planning? I think the biggest thing with planning comes communication and actually being able to speak to each other. I think you can get a lot of stuff done just by able to say, yeah, this is what we want to do. Do you agree? When it comes to at a bigger scale, working with GSAFE and the ACLU, I would say planning comes more into committees, stuff like that. But also social media works a lot with helping plan for that too, because again, it's a big thing with communication.
Thanks for the question, Anya. And now, Gary Wetzel.
I guess my question is, do you find that, however you define protest, that it's a method that's used primarily by people from one segment of the political spectrum? I mean, I can't help but notice that faculty accepted on this panel, you seem all fairly liberal, and you advocate for causes that are sort of loosely defined as liberal causes. Do you find that people like you use protests more than people who have other political persuasions would use other methods to try to get what they want?
I mean, I guess if you look at just definitionally, what someone who is more liberal or what someone who's more conservative may believe, typically conservatives, the definition is to stay with the status quo or to go back to what things were. So I think because of that, a lot of times, certain causes may be more liberal, but if you look through history, it changes because the parties have changed, and I guess core beliefs have changed, and it just depends on what the subject matter is.
I think it doesn't really matter sometimes to what side it is. I think a perfect example of on the spectrum of the right, or not on the right, but I don't even know where they stand, but the Westboro Baptist Church, wherever they lie, they are willing to go and protest with homophobic slurs, against abortion, and they're willing to do it in front of a military funeral of a soldier. So I think that it doesn't primarily lie with the left. Me being myself, I'm primarily down the middle with a lot of this stuff. I might lean a little bit to the left, but I can name a number of instances probably where there have been right protests, proper or not. Down south when they were protesting against the removal of the statues. No matter what your political belief is, if they should stay up or not, they were protesting that. I know there was counter-protesters in Berkeley when the protesters were shutting down Mile Neopolis. Again, no matter what you view of the guy, he still had people willing to counter-protest the protesters. So I think it's not really a spectrum thing. I think it's just more of what people view as the social issue at the moment, and then who's going to protest that.
Just one quick thing to point out. In my experience with protests, it's been either people who are relatively well off, so upper middle class, or people who are not well off at all, economic minorities. I take this to be the economic minorities will say, we have no power except our bodies to go and do this. And those relatively well off will say, if I get arrested, oh well, I've got money, I've got connections, I can handle it. So one of my best friends, who is an anarchist, comes from an incredibly wealthy family. You might ask, is that a necessary condition of that kind of radical belief? It might well be. I find more often than not, when it comes to more engaged protests beyond online material, the middle class just does not get involved.
The event was scheduled for an hour, and if you're, in a certain way unsatisfied and says, "Oh, I have still more questions and I want to follow up," that's kind of a good thing, right? But hopefully, we can have some discussions in the classroom and outside of this venue. But we have to kind of get going at this point. I would like to really, thank the panelists here. I would like to thank the audience. I would also make an announcement briefly for our next event. That'll be next week, Wednesday at 4. Oh shoot, next week, Thursday at 4:30, right here, little theater on injustice, racial injustices in the digital system with very interesting panelists, and I hope you can make it. The event is also co-sponsored by Amnesty International and the Pre-Law Society, and I want to thank them for their efforts going forward. And for this event, this was not planned by myself and Brian Smith, my colleague. This was planned by the Student Advisory Board, and we want to thank them for organizing this, and the president is right here, Eric Osmanson, so thank you very much for doing this.
I'd like to thank the audience for coming to the event.